Hello and welcome to Unit 13 on Service Capacity and Performance Reporting. You may remember back toward the beginning of the semester when I shared the definition that GASB uses for the term economic condition that includes financial position, fiscal capacity, and service capacity. And really basically what we focused on through the various topics we've looked at so far this semester are financial position and fiscal capacity. But service capacity, the ability and willingness of a government to uh, meet the service needs of its constituents, that is an important part of evaluating the overall economic condition of a government and is integral to understanding its financial position and its fiscal capacity, because the financial activities of governments, their financial results, don't exist in a vacuum, and they don't exist for their own purpose. As we know, governments don't exist to generate a profit. The reason that governments exist and the reason they have financial activity is because they are needed to provide services that the public requires. And so this concept of service performance and reporting on service performance are very important, even though we're only providing one lecture out of the semester to this issue. The lecture is divided into two parts. The second part will focus on GASB's suggested guidelines for voluntary reporting of service efforts and accomplishments, or SEA, information, as well as exploring a little bit more how service performance and the reported information about service performance connects with the financial analysis that we've discussed so far. But the first part of the lecture, this part, will be laying the groundwork for understanding how those suggested guidelines came about, and the history of performance measurement and performance reporting and GASB's role in it is quite extensive, and it also, at least in latter years, was quite controversial, and not really because of anything GASB did, but because of the reaction of one professional organization in particular, and I will talk some about that when I get up to that part of the GASB's history. So let's start with that history. I'm not going to belabor this too much, and it may seem like I'm blowing through some of these things, but this is not a history class, and I really want to get on to talking about the actual suggested guidelines that GASB issued and the types of information that reports that follow those suggested guidelines, either in their entirety or in part, can impart to you that can be used to help evaluate a government's financial health, to make decisions about whether to buy its bonds or how to allocate scarce budget resources, so on and so forth. Going all the way back to 1936 to the National Council on Municipal Accounting, which is GASB's earliest predecessor, and the first body to accumulate what then was best practice and prevalent practice in terms of municipal accounting and document it. That first documentation or compilation of those accounting rules that the NCMA assembled envisioned financial statements as being accompanied by what they referred to as statistical tables. And if you go back and look at the list that they provide of what they imagine those statistical tables might provide the user of the financial statements, you'll see that they are the precursors for the statistical section that you see in a government's comprehensive annual financial report this very day. They thought that, based upon what governments do and why governments exist, that it was important not just to have these statements that reported on the financial activities and financial standing of the governments, but also to provide some information, about how that financial activity converted into actual service effort, as the term is used. In other words, the amount of inputs that went into the service that were purchased with those dollars, and the financial transactions, the number of employees, the amount of service provided, the quantity of capital assets and types of capital assets. This was information that they felt should be provided along with the financial statements. In 1951, by this time the organization was now called the National Council on Governmental Accounting, and they updated the accounting compilation that NCMA had first put together and had updated a couple of times. But both of these organizations were really sort of ad hoc organizations. They didn't have any staff. They were the people who performed the work were all doing it on a volunteer basis. So they weren't trying to establish standards so much as they were trying to catalog what the prevailing practice was. And in their compilation, Municipal Accounting and Auditing, which was the very first version of what is known as the Blue Book, or the Government Finance Officers Associations, or GFOA's Governmental Accounting, Auditing, and Financial Reporting Manual. It brought forward those same statistical tables that the NCMA had envisioned as far back as 1936. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was quite a bit of study going on regarding the state of accounting standards and the state of accounting, not in government by itself, but in general, for publicly traded companies, for corporations, not-for-profits, and governments. And two of the efforts that were going on around that time were led by the American Accounting Association, or AAA, which is the Professional Association of Accounting Professors, and the AICPA's True Blood Commission. And in the course of the work that they did and the reports that they issued, they both addressed reporting in the public sector, and as well as the broader not-for-profit sector. And in both cases, made the point that that profit was not the primary motive for those types of organizations. And so the information that they need to report needs to go beyond just quantifying their financial results for the period and their financial position as at the end of the period. That they needed to, in order to satisfy the need for accountability in those types of organizations, to report on whether they were using resources in an efficient manner, and what resulted from the use of those resources. Were they doing what the public was asking for? Were they meeting the objectives and goals that the public had given its elected officials and its appointed officials to accomplish on their behalf? Not long after that, the FASB was created. So there was, for the first time, a dedicated standard-setting body that wasn't a part of the AICPA. It was independent from the accounting industry. The SEC, as you know, acknowledged it as the establisher of generally accepted accounting principles for publicly traded companies. And at that point, they weren't the only standard setter. There was the National, by this time, Council on Governmental Accounting rather than Committee on Governmental Accounting. That was, again, a board of volunteers, but which at least had some staff from first the Municipal Finance Officers Association, and then subsequently that changed its name to the Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA. And remember that name, it's going to come back in a very important way later. They were providing some staffing for that, and it really was the first time that there was a concerted effort to not only catalog what all of those accounting rules were, but to think about how they might be improved on, and between the early 1973, I think that, or 72, something like that, or 74, somewhere around there, around the same exact time FASB was created, is when the National Council on Governmental Accounting was created. And so for about 10 years or so, they were actively working on improving on those standards before the GASB itself was created in '84. And in the meantime, FASB, although a lot of its early work was certainly focused on companies, it was studying the reporting needs of non-business entities or non-business organizations, as they referred to them, and what they were thinking about was both public and private not-for-profits, the public ones being governments. And they too concluded in the report, the research reports that they issued, and in their concept statement number 4 on non-business reporting, that external reporting of finances needed to be accompanied by some type of reporting on the performance of the organization, on its service efforts and accomplishments, its SEA, what it did, with the money and what it accomplished. As I mentioned, the NCGA was actively working at the same time. They too were conducting some studies, and their research study on the reporting objectives for governments directly resulted in their first concept statement. And they identified 6 broad objectives of financial reporting for governments, one of which was to provide information that was useful for evaluating managerial and organizational performance. Looking at things like the efficiency of the government, what results there were from the programs and activities of the government, how effective they were in achieving whatever goals and objectives those programs had. And interestingly, this last one, and I say interestingly because of all these things, this is the one that didn't carry through into the GASB's first concept statement. But information for evaluating the equity with which the burden of providing resources for governmental operations is imposed. That's fascinating. And it's the kind of thing that a lot of people are very interested in and that they do look at. And some of the tax information that you see reported by governments is useful for evaluating who bears the burden of financing government services. This concept statement and the other standards that the NCGA had assembled were passed on to the GASB when it was formed in 1984. And its initial agenda, essentially what was left on the NCGA's agenda, and the starting place for GASB developing its own agenda, included what was called at the time financial condition reporting, and ultimately became the projects that the GASB worked on under the term economic condition reporting, and also service efforts and accomplishments reporting. Remember that also, because GFOA was staffing the NCGA, and they were actively looking at service efforts and accomplishments, and that was one of the things they expected the GASB to work on at that time. So when we get back to GFOA later, you'll see how ironic it is, the way that they reacted to the GASB's work in this area later on. About a year after the GASB was created, the board voted to, they weren't establishing a standard here, but a resolution that called on governments to experiment with SEA reporting and making a commitment to monitor and study what governments were doing, to consider what kind of guidance could be provided, if any, by the GASB to governments that wanted to do this type of reporting. And in fact, GASB concept statement number 1, which in a lot of ways, the objectives of financial reporting in that concept statement reflect a lot of the things that were identified in NCGA's concept statement 1, had a very specific objective with regard to a government's duty to be accountable to its constituents, to the public in general, and its external financial reporting providing the public with the information it needs to hold governments accountable. And one part of that objective specifically talked about providing information to the public that would be useful in assessing the government's service efforts, costs, and accomplishments. Things like efficiency and economy and effectiveness. Those things were identified early on by the GASB as objectives of external financial reporting by governments side by side with things like financial position and financial capacity. The GASB, throughout that first decade of its existence, was actively engaging academics and other researchers in conducting research on what was essentially the state of SEA reporting at that time. GASB ended up publishing an overall summary report called Service Efforts and Accomplishments Reporting, Its Time Has Come, and then 12 separate reports that each looked at a specific service area, ranging from colleges and universities to water and wastewater treatment. And every one of those reports identified some key measures, including outcome measures for each of these services based upon what they were seeing in public. In 1994, so 10 years after GASB was created, the research and monitoring it had done up to that point contributed to the publishing of Concept Statement 2 on service efforts and accomplishments reporting. This is something I'll probably come back to later when we talk about the conceptual framework for SEA reporting. But even though this concept statement was titled Service Efforts and Accomplishments Reporting, it could very well have been titled Accountability Reporting, or at least accountability reporting and service performance reporting or something like that, because a tremendous amount of Concept Statement 2 really was expanding on the idea of accountability and its centrality to financial reporting by governments. And Concept Statement 1 said that accountability was the cornerstone of all financial reporting objectives. So every financial reporting objective flowed from this basic notion of accountability. And Concept Statement 2 really delved into the developing idea of accountability over the years, up to where it stood as of the issuance of Concept Statement number 2. It really is, anybody who asks me about accountability and how it's thought about, I point to that section of Concept Statement 2, because it really is a really brief but on point summary of the development of accountability and public entities over the last 30 or 40 years. The GASB in 1996 conducted a survey of 5,000 governments. It received 900 responses. This was its first survey to understand what was going on as of that time with state and local governments in terms of the use and reporting of performance measures. More than half of the respondents said that they had developed some types of SEA performance measures. Some had a few, some had many. Almost half said that they actually used those performance measures to make decisions of some relevance. But only a third were using output or outcome measures. Truly those are the measures that, they're not the only important measures. Measures of service effort are important as well, especially in the way that they inform output and outcome measures. But ultimately, to evaluate a government's performance, you need measures of its outcomes, what resulted from its provision of service, whether it accomplished what it intended to accomplish by providing those services. That's what you ultimately need in order to evaluate whether the government did a good job or not. Right around that time, GASB applied for and received a substantial grant from the Sloan Foundation to hire some additional staff and conduct more research and monitoring activities. The grants were subsequently the GASB applied for extensions twice and received them, which kept the GASB project on SCA funded through 2006. And what the Sloan Foundation was looking for in return was essentially, you know, in addition to conducting this research and better understanding what was going on, they were very interested in the citizen side of this and engaging citizens about SEA reporting and finding out what it was that they wanted to know, and how they wanted to see that information, how it would be most useful to them, and what they would use that information for. And so some of the things that GASB agreed to do in terms of research, I think, were probably things that they were planning on doing anyway, or along the lines of what they're doing. But certainly, it heightened this citizen-oriented aspect of the research, and what Sloan wanted as a product at the end of this was, based upon the research and the monitoring, to come up with a set of best practices, essentially, or suggested criteria that governments could apply to their SEA performance reporting. And if they were meeting those criteria, that would indicate that they were, doing a good job of reporting on their service performance to the public. They couldn't very well insist that the board establish any type of guidance, but they did, want, this cataloging of best practice to be done, and for GASB to at least consider whether those might be the building blocks of some guidelines that could be provided for governments that were interested in doing service performance reporting. But the board was very clear early on that it didn't expect that anything that came out of the work it had been doing would be a requirement to provide to report on performance. I think that the board's concern, and this is something we'll come back to in looking at the conceptual framework, was that this is an area, although it clearly was within their scope of authority and interwoven with their financial reporting objectives, it also sort of straddled the fence between GASB's role as a standard setter and the role of the governments and their officials in terms of determining their policy and what they want to do and how they want to do it. So I think the board's expectation early on was that if they did promulgate anything, that it wouldn't be a requirement. It would be standards that if a government wanted to report on its performance, it could reference those and follow those, and knowing that they were based on extensive research and monitoring and evaluation. Part of that research, as I mentioned, since the Sloan had the citizen interest, the GASB conducted 19 citizen discussion groups around the country. They also did extensive case studies of 26 state and local governments. And you can see links here in the presentation. In the handout version of these slides, those should be live links. And so if you click on them, they should lead you to the reports on these various parts of the research. GASB also conducted a second survey of the use of SEA performance measures by state and local governments to see how things had changed, if at all, since the previous study they had done, and during this period in which the GASB was actively encouraging experimentation and monitoring practice. And what they did find was that there had been growth in the use of performance measures by governments, and some indication from the respondents to the survey that they intended to increase their use even further. However, there still was a tendency to focus on input and activity measures, a little bit more focus on output measures, which was an improvement, but still not a lot of focus on measures of outcome or the results of service. And then in 2003, the culmination of the research GASB had done was the publishing of a special report that included 16 suggested criteria for preparing effective external reports on SEA performance information. This was the thing that GASB promised it would do as a part of its Sloan grant, and it had a variety of recommendations in it, such as being clear about what the goals and objectives of the government are and of its various services and programs, so that you would have something against which to measure their progress. They say we intend to do A, and then you can look at the measures they provide to determine if they in fact did do A. Presenting information at a variety of levels of detail to serve the various levels of interest of citizens and others who would use the reports. Focusing, not just kind of dumping a whole bunch of information into these reports, but focusing on the most relevant measures that speak most clearly to, the assessment of whether the government has accomplished what it intended to accomplish and done so in an effective and efficient manner. Including indicators of citizen and customer perceptions as being a key type of measure of outcome and effectiveness, and that reporting ought to be done on a regular basis and ought to be close enough to the years that it is reporting on that it's still relevant and useful to the people who are using the reports. Many of these criteria found their way into the GASB's suggested guidelines for voluntary reporting, and in part 2 of the lecture I will talk about those suggested guidelines in more detail. The GASB followed that up with what is essentially like the analyst guide that you use for this course. It's a user guide to service performance reporting. It's some of your readings for this unit are from this book, and the idea behind this was essentially to walk somebody through an SEA report prepared based on the suggested criteria, and explain how to understand that information and how to use it to evaluate a government's performance. The GASB, in the period after publishing the suggested criteria in the special report, was monitoring governments that report their performance measures to see if they were following those guidelines, looking at some that it knew was trying to incorporate those criteria into its own measurement and reporting. And as a part of that, the GASB conducted interviews out in the field with a variety of stakeholders, including governments and people from governments, auditors, citizen groups, legislative staff, municipal bond folks, anybody who has anything to do with performance reporting or an interest in getting that information. And that was helpful in terms of evaluating whether those criteria were on the mark. And one of the things that the interviews suggested was that the criteria were in fact being used by governments that were reporting on their performance measure, and that they were perceived as being valuable. Also, that these people believe that GASB should be involved in furthering the reporting of SEA performance information and in the development of any guidance that might be put out there. And there was also a telephone survey of governments, and that found that 40% of the respondents to the survey were reporting some outcome or results information. And that was definitely an improvement over what had been seen in those first 2 surveys that had been conducted. And there was another, in addition to that 40%, another 30% that do so occasionally. So 40% were frequently reporting to citizens about outcomes and results, and another 30% did so occasionally. And that clearly was a big improvement over the first survey that would have been done 10 years prior. And this was about the time as GASB was wrapping up its work on service performance reporting and getting closer to deciding whether it was going to pursue providing any guidance here, that the proverbial poop hit the proverbial fan. Um, the end of December is when the GASB staff basically wrapped up all of its work and reported back to the board on its findings. The Governmental Accounting Standards Advisory Council, GASB's advisory board, spent some time at its next meeting in March of 2007, giving the board some input on what the board potentially might do in a project on SEA reporting, and not long after that, or right around the same time, GFOA. Remember, I told you to keep there in the back of your head. They went public with a statement that said it wasn't service efforts and accomplishments time that had come; it was GASB's time that had come. They didn't say that, but it's too bad they didn't, because it would have been quite funny, in my opinion. And what I can tell you as a member of the GASB staff at that time was not amusing. GFOA was integral in helping to create the GASB. They more or less turned over, what they had been doing in support of the NCGA, to the GASB to continue that work. And so there was obviously a very close relationship there. And the GASB's second staff director, Dave Bean, came to the GASB in 1990, and he had previously, he came directly from GFOA. He had been GFOA's technical director. And so you could see that there had really been this close relationship between the two organizations. And here we are, less than a quarter century later, and it's all soured. If you have taken my advanced topics course, you know that there is a unit on standard setting in politics and performance measurement. This whole GFOA opposition to the GASB's involvement in SEA reporting is a key part of that. And so if you take that course, or if you have taken it, you'll get a deeper dive into the disagreement between GFOA and GASB. But suffice it to say that GFOA had been looking for a line to draw in the sand with GASB, and they decided that SEA reporting was going to be it. And so they ultimately got to this point where they said, they didn't think GASB needed to exist anymore, and maybe FASB should just take over. Which is, again, without going into this in any detail, I think rather ironic, considering that, as I touched upon earlier, the FASB, when they were studying reporting by governments and not-for-profits, said that clearly they need to do some kind of reporting on their service efforts and accomplishments in order to fully establish their accountability, in addition to the information they present in financial statements. If the GFOA had hoped that the board would back off after they threatened to help end the GASB, it didn't work, because the very next month the GASB deliberated over whether to add a project on SEA, and they voted to do so unanimously. And that project is what led to the suggested guidelines for voluntary reporting. And just in brief, there was 3 years worth of due process after 25 years of research and monitoring. 3 years of due process that included 2 documents for public comment. First, a request for response, and then a proposed suggested guidelines for voluntary reporting, akin to an exposure draft of a statement of governmental accounting standards. But this wouldn't be GAAP. It wouldn't be required, even if a government wanted to apply these or wanted to do SEA reporting. It doesn't have to apply these suggested guidelines, but it could if it wanted to. And if it did, given all the work that went into these, they'd be probably making a pretty good decision to do so. And then lastly, at the end of this project in June 2010 is when the board issued its suggested guidelines for voluntary reporting. Since then, after doing several years of education and assistance with governments as they were trying to adopt some or all of these suggested guidelines in their own reporting. The GASB's work in this area has largely reverted to just monitoring of practice and answering questions, but we haven't been doing anything active in it, since the early 2010s. And at this point, I'm not really sure what the future of that work is. We're about to see a new chairman come in June of next year, and maybe that chairman will be somebody who wants to resurrect this. But at this time, I really don't know what the future of GASB's involvement in. It may be that GASB has done everything that it needs to do. That remains to be seen. So let's talk a little bit about the conceptual framework. I've already touched upon this objective of financial reporting from GASB Concept Statement number 1. And then in GASB Concept Statement 2, which was amended by GASB Concept Statement 5, and that's the other product of the GASB's project. It put out those suggested guidelines for voluntary reporting, but it also amended Concept Statement 2 on service efforts and accomplishments reporting to reflect what it had learned during all of the research it was doing. And among several things that the board wanted to make a point of clarifying in these amendments to Concept Statement 2 was what its interest was in SEA reporting and what it believed its area of responsibility was. And they very clearly said, as you can see in this excerpt here, that they thought it was beyond the scope of their work to establish the goals and objectives that state and local governments have, or what their specific measures are that they should be reporting, or establishing benchmarks against which their performance could be evaluated. The board viewed those as the purview of the officials of state and local governments. And what GASB's role was to give them guidance that would help them to identify appropriate measures and to report them meaningfully to the public. As I mentioned before, there's so much in Concept Statement 2, and it's all still there, and if anything, strengthened by Concept Statement 5, regarding accountability. And Concept Statement 2 refers back to this part of Concept Statement 1 that talked about accountability being implicit in all of the objectives of financial reporting, and that the board considers it to be the paramount objective from which all other objectives must flow. And Concept Statement 2 then really built on that idea and expanded upon what was meant by accountability, and provided a lot of additional input and information about the notion of accountability. It also really kind of laid out the foundational ideas behind service efforts and accomplishments reporting, including identifying the different types of measures. The first of which, and those kinds that governments were most commonly reporting, and that were even entertained way back in 1936, were measures of service efforts. So talking about both financial and non-financial resources that go into providing service, like the number of employees, like the amount of dollars that were spent, like the volume of capital assets that the government has and can use in the provision of services. So the financial measures, speak to the cost of providing service. So you're talking about dollars there. You're talking about assets and liabilities and revenues and expenses. And the non-financial measures are things like the number of employees, or the volume of capital assets they have, or even sort of the number or activity level of a service that has been performed. Then there are two kinds of measures of service accomplishments, where you're reporting not on what was used in terms of resources, but what those resources purchased, what the government was able to do with those resources in terms of providing services that were intended to meet the goals and objectives of the government. One of those measures of accomplishments are output, which measure the quantity or the amount or level of service that's provided, and the other one, and really the paramount one, uh, are the outcome measures, which uh, help you to assess, uh, if the government did what it wanted to do or how close it got to doing what it wanted to do. So on the output measure side, you have measures the quantity of service, so number of customers served, number of riders on the subway, number of students enrolled, number of persons receiving public assistance or enrolled in Medicaid. Those are all level of service um, indicators, and there may also be some level of service provided, of a certain level or a certain quality or a certain type of service that where you're starting to get toward, um, measures of outcome. For instance, not just the number of students enrolled, but the number of students who scored above a certain level on an exam, or the number that graduated within a certain number of years. Um, for um, public assistance, it might be the number of applicants for public assistance who were helped within a certain amount of time, or who received their uh, the benefits to which they were entitled. And then outcome measures. This is where you're truly talking about what happened, what the end result was for the services. So now you're talking about, rather than number of students enrolled or number of students who graduated, you're talking about number of students who graduated and successfully entered college or got a meaningful job in the workforce, rather than just the number of people who were inmates in a city's jails, the number who, after leaving the jails, had not committed a crime within 2 years after release, or the number who had gotten a meaningful job after being released from jail. Not just the number of patients served in a hospital, but the number that were served and remained healthy afterward, that didn't require any follow up, or who didn't require any additional medical attention after their initial treatment. The concept statement 2 differentiated those measures based upon essentially time frame. Look, because sometimes, as you know, with some services, it's accomplishing their goals is not a matter of what they did any particular year. It's what they're doing year after year after year that ultimately helps them to achieve their goals. So some outcome measures might be looking at results that were seen right after the service was provided, whereas others may be looking at kind of intermediary steps that getting somebody who was homeless into a particular program that would give them some training and help them to find a place to live, as kind of an intermediate step toward an ultimate outcome measure of the number that become gainfully employed and that have a place of their own to live in. So that there may be some steps along the way that are progress indicators that show, okay, we're getting toward the area that we want to be. For instance, if you were looking at test scores, and man, that is an area that is ripe for debate as to whether they really are appropriate measures of whether a school district has accomplished what it's supposed to. But if your ultimate goal in the school district was to get all of the students up to a certain level, in terms of their scores, there might be an intermediate, measure that said, well, we're going to get them to this level first, and then we're going to get them to a higher level beyond that, before reaching our ultimate goal. Those are the varieties of types of outcome measures that you might see governments reporting. And then there are, in addition to measures of service efforts and measures of service accomplishments, there are measures that relate service efforts to service accomplishments that are essentially taking measures of each kind and combining them into a ratio. For instance, efficiency measures that relate service efforts to outputs of services. So, cost per student educated, cost per patient admitted, cost per dollar, cost per ton of garbage collected, number of teachers per student, or flipping that over, number of students per classroom or per teacher. And then efficiency measures that relate service efforts to the outcomes or results of the services. So now we're not just talking about cost per student, but cost per student who, after graduation, becomes gainfully employed or gets admitted to college. That is a cost you would expect to be considerably higher than just the cost related to all students. Instead of cost per lane mile of road repaving, maybe the cost to get roads that are a certain level of smoothness or higher. So you're measuring not just how much it costs to repave the road, but how much it costs to pave the road in a way that meets the goal of making the streets smooth and making people's travel over those streets problem-free. There is another section of Concept Statement 2 that more or less replicates parts of Concept Statement 1, but specifically within the context of SEA performance reporting. So it talks about the qualitative characteristics of reporting, the 6 characteristics that apply to all information that is reported in general purpose external financial reports: relevance, reliability, comparability, consistency, timeliness, and understandability. I'm amazed that I remembered those. There's always one, it seems to me, of those 6 that I can't remember at any given time. It also went through the objectives of financial reporting again and looked at them through the prism of SEA reporting and which ones specifically were relevant to SEA reporting. And then the last major section looked at what it considered to be the limitations of SEA performance measures. And the board at the time that Concept Statement 2 came out, I think, was trying to temper expectations somewhat and say, look, even the best performance measures are not, the be-all and end-all of understanding service performance. So among the things that they said were that, there's no single measure or composite measure that is going to by itself adequately explain whether a government's services or programs were successful. And even service performance measures by themselves are not enough to explain what happened behind the scenes or in the black box. So they might tell you what they accomplished, but not why things turned out the way they did, or how they managed to end up at that area, or of the factors that might have contributed, how which were the most important and which were the least important. The concepts in Concept Statement 2 really don't talk about measures of processes or activities, but those could be, in fact, valuable, particularly for understanding and interpreting the measures of outcome and the accomplishments of service. It can be very difficult to determine what the best measures are. And I mentioned one in passing, test scores. I also mentioned at one point graduation rates. And if you asked any general person, name 2 measures that you think would indicate whether a school district's doing a good job or not, I bet you a lot of people would say those 2. Graduation rates and test scores. Let's just for a second attack graduation rates. all that means is that they've left the system, with a diploma, which you would hope means that they're well educated, but all it really means is that they've left the system with a diploma. And there certainly are notable examples in real life of school districts that have advanced this notion of social promotion, where they just eventually, not because the academic accomplishments of the students justified being graduated, but that they just eventually were aging out, and the system graduated them, and even somebody who did manage to get the sufficient grades to earn their graduation, you know, is the ultimate goal of the school district to just churn out diplomas, or is it supposed to be doing something like preparing students to be contributing members of society, or to get a decent job, or to go on to college? And so that really is the thing that you want to then look at is, well, you know, did they, were they able to go to college? Were they able to get a good job, after they graduated? And that's the same kind of thing if you're looking at colleges and universities. The graduation rates, they certainly all report them. It's common to look at cohorts of graduation within 4 years, within 5 years, within 6 years. But what really is meaningful is what kind of job did people get when they graduated and they got their degree? How much money are they making? Those are really the things that indicate whether the school has done a good job or not, I suppose. You could argue that back and forth as well. Um, I mentioned jails before. That what you really want to know is whether people have been corrected or not. That's what prisons and jails are referred to as corrections. The idea is that you're not just punishing the person for the crime they committed, but hopefully doing something for them so that when they leave jail, they are less likely to commit a crime than they were before. So you need to be able, I think, to measure whether you've done a good job, to follow people once they've left the prison or jail system, to see if they're, if they have a good job, if they are staying out of trouble, keeping their nose clean, any metaphors you want to use. The concept is called recidivism. They want to make sure that, people aren't, who once they're released, aren't going back to lives of crime. And, the question that you want to ask is, well, why don't governments measure these ultimate measures that are better indicators of whether they've accomplished what they want to do? And the reason is that it's extremely difficult to do. The prison systems, jail systems, are connected with the with the probation departments, which are monitoring people who've been released from jail or prison. But as you well know, sometimes they can keep track of people who've been released, and sometimes they can't. And I'd say, sorry, it's especially likely that somebody who might be slipping back into a life of crime would be somebody that they would lose track of. That would be someone who might not want to come back and see their probation officer. And ultimately, they won't really know whether somebody has recidivized until the person has actually been arrested and convicted of another crime. And by that point, the obvious measure, is showing that, in fact, they weren't successful. The same is true with tracking students after graduation. It's hard to do and it's expensive. And that's a balance. And the reason why more governments, the primary reason why more governments don't do outcome measures is because they're not easy to measure. They're not easy to compile, and they can, in some cases, be expensive. So with that, we're ready to go to the second part of the lecture. This first part is over. We'll pick up in the second part of the lecture with discussing GASB's suggested guidelines for voluntary reporting.